From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Limes.
Congress certifies Donald Trump's Electoral College victory without a single objection 4 years after the January 6th proceedings were interrupted by a mob of rioters.
We're joined by former Republican Congressman Denver Riggleman, who advised the January 6th committee for his take on the process and on President-elect Trump's promise to pardon those who attacked the Capitol.
And as Trump urges Republican lawmakers to tackle border security and tax cuts in a single bill, we'll talk about the agenda for the new Congress with former Representative Cheri Bustos of Illinois. Right here on the Monday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, and not just any Monday. It's January 6th. And Kaylee, that was obviously something that people were very concerned about leading into the process following the events of 4 years ago. They got it done today without a hitch.
Yeah, the only hitch, perhaps, was the snow surrounding the Capitol. A lot of it fell on the D.C. area today, and yet these proceedings did go smoothly, rather quickly, just about half an hour of reading out the results of each state, ultimately to be formally certified by Vice President Kamala Harris.
The votes for President of the United States are as follows. Donald J. Trump of the state of Florida has received 312 votes. Kamala D. Harris of the state of California has received 226 votes. This announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons elected President and Vice President of the United States.
And joining us now from the snowbound Capitol is Bloomberg's Mike Dorning with more on our top story. Mike, you've covered a couple of these. It's good to see you, and thanks for being with us on this January 6th. There was a lot different than what happened 4 years ago for many reasons, including the fact that there were no objections, which is not typically something that you see.
Well, the objections, there had been a few objections in years prior to January 6th, but the big thing is that this year there wasn't the cascade of objections that there was on January 6th, and it went just as usual. It's a sort of a ritual of democracy. It was uninterrupted. This is the way it usually is, like a short joint session, and the result is usually foreordained.
Well, of course, the result was pretty clear this time. No one was contesting it ultimately, Mike, but just talk about the kind of the visual of Kamala Harris certifying her own defeat like that and what that symbolizes for American democracy.
And that is a part of American democracy that, you know, has gone on for a long time. In fact, Mike Pence, one of the things he said that he watched as he was trying to figure out what to do was he watched Al Gore stand there and certify his own defeat in the year 2000 when the election was very bitterly contested and the Supreme Court intervened to stop the counting in a way that a lot of Democrats thought were unfair. Nonetheless, Al Gore just accepted the verdict of the courts and not only didn't protest it, but he, like Kamala Harris, stood up there, announced that his opponent won, and declared that the will of the people. Same thing, Kamala Harris today, I saw her with, the Republicans started applauding when she announced the total that Trump received, and she kind of gave a tight-lipped smile and a nod, and stood there like a vice president and accepted the results. That's their job, and they did it.
It also seems to be the job of this administration to remind people of what happened 4 years ago, Mike. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the media front that we saw today. Joe Biden writing an op-ed about this in the Washington Post, talking about how it used to be a pro forma routine act and how things changed, of course, that we will never take for granted, he said, what happened after what happened 4 years ago. Kamala Harris actually produced a full video that was posted on social media. She talked about her sacred obligation, all of this done in advance of the certification today, as Democrats clearly don't want to forget what happened 4 years ago.
So I think this is serves two purposes, one political and one kind of preventive. Politically, they want to contrast themselves as kind of fair-minded people who accept the will of the people and sort of set up criticism for Trump if he pardons the January 6th protesters, as he seems likely to do, not just the protesters, but the rioters and the people convicted of assaulting police and all of that. So they're setting up a political game here for Democrats, but also to the extent they are genuinely worried about authoritative tendencies in the Trump administration, they're trying to set up an insulation against authoritarian, non-democratic moves by underscoring the importance of these democratic norms and heightening and lifting them up. You also saw that with the Medal of Freedom awards to some of the people who investigated the January 6th Commission. All of that serves, one, a pro-democratic preventative purpose and also a partisan political purpose.
All right, Bloomberg's Mike Dorning, thank you so much. Meantime, Donald Trump today said he will not be paring back his tariff policy, pushing back against reporting in the Washington Post this morning that his administration was considering a plan for universal tariffs on all countries, but only on specific critical imports. Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Peggy Collins. So, Peggy, I guess he's kind of leaving us guessing here, though it seems pretty clear he does not agree with the Post.
That's right. I think what President Trump is trying to do is two main things, it doubled down on the fact that tariffs are going to be core to his administration, and that's taking hold just in a couple of weeks. And also that he is anticipating that tariffs will not only be a negotiating tool, as they were for him the first time around, but also a revenue raiser. You know, on the campaign trail, he promoted or floated a number of tax deductions, credits, such as taxes on tips, and that tariffs would be the way to pay for those. So he wants to make sure that people know that he considers tariffs one of his core governing models, but also that that's how he's going to deliver for the people across the country that he promised many of those things to.
As we kept hearing, though, Peggy, and it's great to have you on with us today, this was an opening salvo we heard from Trump supporters, that it was the beginning of a negotiation, that maybe these tariffs would not be across the board. So it sounds to me like this reporting is kind of in line with what we've heard. Is Donald Trump just concerned about presenting this idea that he's not making good on promises before he's sworn into office?
Well, I think, campaign promises are suspended in time, and the campaign is now transitioning towards governing. But also, there was some vagueness into the proposals, even on the campaign trail. He came out of the gate saying 10 to 20% across the board, which would have been different than his first administration and what they're saying. He's saying they're not paring back, but also 60% on China on certain goods. And then early on after his election, he talked about tariffs on Mexico and Canada coming right out of the gate. So I think, again, they are trying to signal through their comments today that tariffs are going to be core to the way that they govern, and in two main ways. One, in terms of how they can bring other countries to the table, but also in terms of how they can raise revenue to pay for some of the promises that they've made. One last point I'll make is that they are going to be taking over at a time that inflation is still an issue for many, many Americans and for the Fed, which we cover so much at Bloomberg. And so they are going to have to deal with what many economists say will be a challenge for tariffs. And that is, how do you balance putting tariffs on with potentially not causing higher inflation?
Well, Peggy, you just mentioned Canada. Of course, we also got the news today that Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is resigning. How is that related to trade and the incoming relationship with the Trump administration?
Well, our Canadian colleagues have obviously been covering this story for the last several months as it's become more dramatic by the day. But I do think, Trump even just today tweeted about Canada being the 51st state. So he has not let up in terms of pointing at Canada and our relationship, but also Trudeau and his deputies have clearly lost faith in each other. And they are now trying to posture for who could be best in terms of not only providing for Canada, but also negotiating and dealing with its neighbor under the power of Trump.
Trump truthing today. Many Canadians have enjoyed living in the 51st state, which they may not have been aware of. Peggy, thank you. Bloomberg's Peggy Collins in Washington. Coming up on Balance of Power, we spent some time with Cheri Bustos, the former Democratic Congresswoman from Illinois, as we mark the certification of this U.S. election and look ahead to the congressional agenda next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's a completely different situation. Gratefully, it's different in some ways. I mean, I obviously preferred a different outcome in this past election. But as you can see, my colleagues, Democratic colleagues, who are disappointed in the outcome, disagree with the choice, are there to certify the will of the American people. It's what democracy is supposed to look like, even when we disagree with the outcome.
It's Dan Kildee, the former Democratic congressman from Michigan, talking with us today on the early edition of Balance of Power on the difference between the events of today, a scene of snowy calm in Washington, as opposed to the violence of 4 years ago. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, you can see that contrast in a literal sense. Joining us now, another member of Congress who was in the chamber that day, Cheri Bustos, the former Democratic congresswoman from Illinois. It's good to see you, Congresswoman. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I wonder your thoughts as you watched this take place today and you saw lawmakers and the institutions in Washington work and do their jobs.
Well, that is what they were elected to do. And, the story that sometimes gets overlooked from 4 years ago is what we were elected to do that day. We ended up doing. It was in the middle of the night and obviously disrupted by rioters and insurrectionists. But one of the highlights of that entire day on January 6th of 2021 was the decision that was made by Speaker Nancy Pelosi to go back in session later that night after the police officers and the National Guardsmen and women were exhausted and lying down on the floor in the rotunda. Some of whom had been beaten and did all they could to make sure that we were safe. But we went back in session and we did certify the results of the Electoral College. And so I guess if I want to look back on that day, it was one of the worst days in American history, one of the worst days in my life personally. But at least it ended in the way that it should. And we did get our jobs done, just like they're getting their jobs done today.
Well, it's an excellent point, Congresswoman, about how it all ended. But we still have questions as to how the stories of these many, many perpetrators who rioted at the Capitol that day will end, as there's been more than 1,000 who have been convicted or pleaded guilty to crimes on that day. And yet Donald Trump has promised 2 weeks from now, on his very first day back in office, many of those individuals will be pardoned. What do you think about that?
Well, look, they went through the process that our founding fathers have set up. We have the different divisions of power in our nation, one of which is the judiciary. You had the Department of Justice, who built cases around these people, and they were convicted in a court of law. And for Donald Trump then on January 20th to enter as our president again and say that they should all be pardoned, or that the vast majority of them should be pardoned, or whoever he ends up pardoning from that day, I think is a disgrace. Dan Kildee, who you had on earlier, he and I were both elected in 2012 to serve in the Congress. And I appreciate what he said about how the current Congress is doing their job today. But, Donald Trump should do the job of the president of the United States and make sure that he will take an oath to the Constitution on January 20th. And I hope that he takes that oath very seriously. But it sounds like he's going to disregard it in the sense that he will pardon. It's within his right as a president to pardon the insurrectionists, but I think it's the wrong thing to do. And again, as somebody who was there that day, I think it's a disgrace.
The chief of the U.S. Capitol Police seems to agree with you, Congresswoman, in an exclusive interview with the Washington Post, asking what message does that send to police officers across this nation if someone does not think a conviction for an assault or worse against a police officer is something that should be upheld, given what we ask police officers to do every day. Would it behoove the president-elect to go case by case? Are you concerned about blanket pardons, or should nonviolent offenders be considered?
Again, it's within his right to do what pardons he wants to do. We just saw President Biden put out a whole litany of pardons. That said, I'm married to a guy who spent 40 years of his life in law enforcement. He was the sheriff of the county where we raised our family, Rock Island County, Illinois. It was my husband on the day of January 6th. I sent out a family text, and like many people have text chains with their family members, and I said, hey, I just want to let everybody know I'm okay. And they were all working and didn't have a television set on and didn't know what was going on. So they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, turn your TV on. And it was my husband who said, just listen to the police. They will keep you safe. And now, as you look back on January 6, 2021, we had more than 140 police officers who were hurt. Some ended up losing their lives. If you look at Officer Brian Sicknick, who died the day after January 6th, he had been at the insurrection and was on the receiving end of some violence, and then had strokes and died the next day. And, I guess I think about his family and what they will think of pardons that President Trump is promising to do. And, so it's the police officers were the ones in the National Guardsmen and women, to the tune of 140 of them who were injured, some severely, some who lost their lives that day, who I really think personally, how hard it must be on those police officers and their families that President-elect Trump is considering doing this.
Well, Congresswoman, we really appreciate your reflections on that day as you were there. I'd also like to ask you this next question, keeping in mind that you used to chair the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. In your mind, what does the Democratic Party need to do so that on the next January 6th, in 2029, they are certifying the victory of a Democratic president, and the joint session that is gathered is a Democratic majority in both the House and Senate?
I think we have a lot of work to do. And, I feel like this has become cliche, but it is what worked best for me. I was, a Democrat. I won 5 straight elections for Congress. I won 7 straight elections, 2 for city council and 5 for Congress. I've never lost an election. And I served in a Republican area. Donald Trump won the congressional district that I served. At the same time, I won it by 20 points. In 2016, when he was first elected, I won it by 24 points 2 years later. So I think that I'm qualified to talk about how a Democrat can do well in a Republican region. And it starts with listening to people. Again, I think that has become somewhat cliche, but I don't think we need to go in as a party and act like we have the answers. I actually had made this recommendation early on to President Biden when he was still in the race, and suggested that he and his team go into only swing districts that are labeled as rural regions and only in swing states, and go in and listen and ask what did they want to see in a next presidency that would be led, again, at the time Joe Biden was still the person who was running. What did they want to see in a next Biden term? And not go in there and guide the answers or try to steer the conversation in a certain direction, but to listen. And I think that is when we should draw up what our next platform looks like, by listening to the American public, especially those in regions that we don't have a tendency to go in, spend time in, and listen to the people.
All right, Cheri Bustos, former Democratic Congresswoman from Illinois, thank you so much for joining us. Coming up, Michael Barr planning to step down as the Fed's vice chair of supervision. We'll have more on that story next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Do you believe that the president has the power to fire or demote you, and has the Fed determined the legality of a president demoting at will any of the other governors with leadership positions?
Not permitted under the law.
Not what?
Not permitted under the law.
That was Fed Chair Jay Powell 2 months ago. But today, Michael Barr, the Fed's vice chair of supervision, decided not to test the theory of what pressure incoming President Trump could apply, announcing that while he'll remain a Fed governor, he'll step down from his supervisory role by February 28th. He said in his statement, quote, "The risk of a dispute over the position could be a distraction from our mission." Joining us now for more is Nathan Dean of Bloomberg Intelligence. So, Nathan, does this effectively mean bye-bye Basel III?
You know, I think it doesn't mean bye-bye Basel III, but it certainly coins what I'm calling for 2025 is that's the great pause of Basel III. I think, the Basel III endgame is this rule that could potentially increase in capital requirements for the big banks around 9%. We give it about a 30% chance that it's going to move forward this year. Now, there are still questions about whether or not we'll move forward in 2026. But, as Michael Barr just said, he's leaving effective February 28th or when the successor is confirmed. So it's going to be up to President Trump's regulatory leadership to make that decision. And if it does move forward, it's certainly going to be more amicable to the banking sector than that 9%.
Well, we know that you get a lot of interesting phone calls. Nathan Dean, you've been traveling the world recently talking with Bloomberg clients about what the incoming Trump administration is going to mean for investments. Does this help to fulfill the whole idea of animal spirits starting after January 20th? And what questions are you hearing today?
Yeah, so in this case, especially when you talk about financials and Michael Barr, there was a lot of sentiment in the market about deregulation. And a lot of people, I think, feel that there's this magic wand that President Trump can wave and just say deregulate and go forth. But it is up to the Administrative Procedures Act, and there's a process. And when it comes to banks, it's the Fed, the OCC, and the FDIC. And Michael Barr was the last remaining piece of that Biden era that would actually delay a lot of that bank deregulation. Now, look, going forward, if let's just say federal governor Michelle Bowman, it takes the new vice chair of supervision perspective, you're still going to have to get it through Jerome Powell. But as Jerome Powell has shown before, he's amicable to certain tweaks. So this certainly speeds up the deregulatory effort. There's still no magic wand. But instead of things starting in 2026 and going into 27 and 2028, they can start effectively this year. And you can see the benefits for the companies. So they can see the benefits of that deregulation effort much sooner.
He's just the guy we wanted to talk to you about this today. Bloomberg Intelligence's Nathan Dean. Nathan, thank you so much. Kaylee, we're going to have to put the Basel III T-shirts, I guess, on ice for now.
Well, and there's plenty of Republicans on Capitol Hill pretty thrilled about that.
Should go over pretty well, I suspect, with at least some crowds. Coming up, we'll be joined by Denver Riggleman, former Republican congressman of Virginia, former advisor to the January 6th committee, on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I do believe very strongly that America's democracy is only as strong as our willingness to fight for it. Every single person, their willingness to fight for and respect the importance of our democracy. Otherwise, it is very fragile and it will not be able to withstand moments of crisis. And today, America's democracy stood.
Vice President Kamala Harris speaking earlier today at the U.S. Capitol, not long after she certified the results of the 2024 presidential election as part of her official duties. Joining us now for more here on Bloomberg TV and radio is former Republican Congressman Denver Riggleman of Virginia, who was an advisor to the House January 6th Select Committee. Denver, thank you for being with us. As we heard the vice president today talk about democracy standing, what to you did today mean for American democracy, knowing the stark contrast it painted with the events of 4 years ago?
Well, first, it's amazing how many people voted to certify the election today. And that's something that, I was tracking, actually, and you probably both could imagine why I was tracking that. And it looked like nobody rose up in defiance, or there wasn't some kind of coordinated effort to object to the electors. And I think that's something that is important to the United States. I think the flip side to me is it looked like that there was nobody really that worried about a stolen election this time. And, I think that's what I find so interesting is that there weren't Kamala Harris or Joe Biden supporters storming the Capitol. And not only that, you didn't have this churn and this lie and this overarching conspiratorial, sort of nature of things where you have people saying the election was stolen, it was Chinese servers, it was Italian satellites. It was Hugo Chavez. It was broken algorithms. It was white bands burning ballots. It was Republican observers being locked out of certain spaces. It was German server farms. It was NSA, right? It was hammer and scorecard. I think seeing that the 2020 lies in 2021 and this activity, I'm going to say, was coup-like movements. I know people are afraid to say it. The fact is, what got me, there's a peaceful transfer of power after 77 million Americans or so and voters didn't really care what happened on that awful day 4 years ago. So it's been almost feeling like I'm a stranger in my own country at times, and almost talking to people that were on the Hill today who called me, and I had so many phone calls today. Like, Denver, it's like nothing happened. It's just bizarre here. And we're still traumatized by 4 years ago. A lot of the reporters I talked to today, and they said nobody really gives a rat's. And I think for me, that's going to actually bite us in the next few years pretty badly.
Well, there's been a lot of talk about whitewashing, what happened 4 years ago. This is why Joe Biden wrote an op-ed, I'm sure, in the Washington Post this morning. A lot of Democrats, at least, are trying to remember what took place. But it's interesting, Denver, let's get into it a little bit. You mentioned the fact that there were no lawmakers objecting to the results today. Both parties have had their turn doing that, and we can put the rioters aside for a moment. Remember, a handful of Democrats objected in 2000 and in 2004 to the results. There were none on either side today, and some have been asking if that would have been the case if Donald Trump had not won the election. What do you think?
No, it would have been an absolute awful time that we would be having right now. And I think that's what people know. Again, over these next 4 years, and I know that I've talked to both of you about why I started these companies, these data companies, is because of what I saw on January 6th. It affected me that much. And I think that op-ed is like, listen, everybody, we had an individual who pushed so many lies into the political ecosystem that, and if you look at thousands descending, right, on the ellipse, how many people are in jail right now? People who believed in these fantasy lies, who sacked the Capitol, attacked law enforcement. And I know, Joe, you said about those that had, objected to electors in the past, Democrats in the past. Mm-hmm. There's a difference between objecting and beating officers and law enforcement, and actually trying to change the vote, to deny the electors, to get Mike Pence to deny the electors, to have gallows outside of the Capitol building. I think, again, there has to be that line of how nuts it really was 4 years ago.
Well, Denver, earlier today on the early Balance of Power, we spoke with Mick Mulvaney, who was former acting White House chief of staff in the first Trump administration. He ultimately resigned from the administration on January 6th because he was so angered by the events of that day. And he talked to us about how surprising it was. Take a listen to what he said, and I'll have you respond.
I am the worst person to ask that question of, because I didn't see it coming in the first place. I really didn't. And that's what frightens me the most about that day, is that not only did I not see it coming, if you'd asked me, he said, Mick, if there'd be riots and a transition, I never would have thought it would have been my party, the law and order party, that was involved with it in any fashion. Mm-hmm. So I am the wrong person to ask about what we might have seen today if the outcome had been different, because I didn't see it 4 years ago.
Denver, based on what you've seen and your involvement in this investigation, could we see the next one coming? Do you think there could be a next one?
I think there really could be. I think when you look at January 6th, it was a bit of a practice run. I think a lot of the planning that we saw with the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, other what they call Western chauvinist groups, which are white nationalist groups, some of that planning they did on Facebook, they did on messaging, they did on, the Donald.win, or they're talking about it on the Chans, or they're talking about it in more of an open type of way of doing this. I think it's going to be much more difficult to see the next one coming, or any type of obfuscation. They're going to be able to obfuscate based on using more encrypted channels and encrypted platforms, because they learned their lesson. You have Signal, you have Threema, right? You have WhatsApp. You have things that are very difficult to crack, for law enforcement and also for national security. So I think what you're going to see next time is you might not see it coming as much, but you know what? There's a thing that I always talk about, right? When you're talking about data, right? You got the leakers, right? Those are the ones who leak the data out, and they do it accidentally because they don't have good OPSEC. But it's the people who brag about it, and you still have stupid people in the communications ecosystem. And so we're going to have to count on those stupid people who aren't using encrypted apps next time this might happen. And I guarantee you, Trump is a lame duck this time, But if something, again, untoward happens where Republicans lose in the next cycle, you're going to see the same type of churn and stolen election theories that come out, because this conspiracy theory has now metastasized and normalized itself within the American public. And I think, again, it goes back to data and facts. But, like I said at the beginning, it's just going to be tougher. They learned a lot of lessons. And here we are. Donald Trump won. The stolen election theory, conspiracy theory, perpetuated over the last 4 years. Listen, I'm happy to be on here. Bloomberg is so much more data-based, and I'm not trying to blow smoke, so much more data-based than the other networks, because you have pundits taking the place of experts. And I think what you did, in order to have access, in order to whitewash what's happening, you try to be nice or normalize ridiculousness, insanity, and violence. And I think that 4 years of this sort of quasi-normalization, not quite know where to go, we weren't truthful enough with the American public. And again, I think that bites us in the rear parts as we move forward these next years when we talk about facts and data in the media ecosystem and the political ecosystem.
Well, then maybe I know how you're going to answer this, but I'll ask you, Denver, do we go back to January 6th being a pro forma event in Washington that no one covers, kind of a boring day in a joint session of Congress that's meaningful but doesn't actually make news? Or this is something that we're going to relive and relitigate every 4 years?
I think the media is going to be on top of it now every 4 years, but I think people like me aren't going to stop until we're in the ground talking about what happened on that day. There's some penultimate, there's times in my life that affected me. 9/11, I deployed right after 9/11. January 6th affected me way because I was getting the phone calls from my colleagues in the House while it was happening. I had only been there 3 days prior, Joe, 3 days prior. And I think that's the thing, is being part of the investigations, part of the second impeachment, part of the January 6th investigations, and then what I've been doing in media and writing the book and looking at the data for so long. I think right now the United States is in really a bad way when it comes to policy being made with people who either lie about what's happening or don't have the ability to discern between truth and fantasy. And again, that is a long, slippery slope. I hope January 6th becomes just a pro forma event, but I'm just not sure if it ever will be, not ever again.
Well, we're glad you could join us on this day of days, of course. That's Denver Riggleman, the former Republican congressman from the great state of Virginia. It's good to see you, Denver. Thank you. Coming up, the 2024 election has been certified today, indeed, peacefully and without incident. We'll play it to our signature political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I respect the fact that nobody objected. I think that's a good thing. And I think Democrats probably decided it was better for their brand long-term not to object. I applaud the way it went down today. It's the smooth transition of power. I'm a huge fan, and I think it was a class move today to do this. But it certainly undermines some of the hyperbole that they were using going into the election.
That's Mick Mulvaney, the former acting White House chief of staff in the first Trump administration, co-founder of the Freedom Caucus, commenting on the early edition of Balance of Power on the lack of objections from Democrats during today's election certification. Indeed, it is January 6th, and they got the job done. Joining us now is our signature panel, Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, alongside Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Great to see you both back here 4 years later. Rick, this was a good day for the system to work, as they say, but I wonder what was going through your mind and the contrast based on what we saw 4 years ago, that not a single lawmaker objected.
Yeah, well, it wasn't a concerted effort to try and destabilize the election. And when you actually allow the election to stand and you follow the rules prescribed by law, you get a day like today. If you try to deny the outcome of an election and try to disrupt the counting of these electoral votes, then you get what you got 4 years ago. So, I mean, it's not like the election was any different. The election was honest 4 years ago. And it was honest this year. And it generally has been honest for as long as we've been breathing air. The reality is that some politicians have used and tried to disrupt elections to their own gain. And hopefully we have learned a lesson that it didn't work 4 years ago. And it's probably one of the reasons why nobody tried to mess with it this time. We've tightened up the rules to be better at it than we even were before. But we have a solid system, and I don't think the public would allow anybody to try and manipulate the system the way it was done 4 years ago.
Well, when we think about the American democratic system, Jeannie, obviously we heard the vice president today at the Capitol say that democracy stood today. I do wonder, though, what it will mean just 2 weeks later on January 20th, once Donald Trump has taken office, if he pardons some of these individuals that were violent at the Capitol 4 years ago. What would that mean for democracy?
Yeah, and that is going to be a big test for Donald Trump. Already today, we had Enrico Tarrio, the leader of the Proud Boys, convicted for seditious conspiracy, serving 22 years in jail for what happened on January 6th and his leadership in that. And his attorney appealed to Donald Trump today on the 4th anniversary for a pardon. And we had the J6 families, as they're known, out in full force saying they want pardons, and not just for a select group of these people, but for everybody who was convicted. This is, over 1,000 people, as you've been talking about. And this is a group that is not going to keep quiet if Donald Trump doesn't fulfill that promise. So I think in some ways it's typical of what Donald Trump is going to face in a few days, which is that he overpromised in many capacities on the campaign trail to get elected, and people are going to hold his feet to the fire. And when you heard those J6 families out today, they said very clearly they're going to hold his feet to the fire. Every single one of these people pardoned. 60% of the American public does not agree with that kind of approach by Donald Trump. So it's going to set up a battle.
What's your take on this, Rick? We heard from the chief of Capitol Police today asking what message it would send to law enforcement if we saw across-the-board pardons. Could Donald Trump, though, satisfy the American people if this were a more concerted effort focused on nonviolent offenders, if they gave the impression at least that they went case by case?
I don't think there's any way to try and mitigate the damage that would be done to Donald Trump and the MAGA movement if people who broke into the Capitol on the day of counting the electoral votes are somehow pardoned. And that's just a decision Donald Trump has to make for himself. He has the power to do so, whether it's the less violent people who broke into the Capitol or the more violent ones that injured police and other innocents. It's going to be his call, and his call will dictate whether or not the public takes it out on the MAGA movement and on Donald Trump's presidency. He is a lame duck, but he's not immune to popularity. And if he starts to chip away at it right away, it could really, severely constrain his ability to get things through Congress.
Well, and we still have to talk about his ability to get things through Congress and just how that might happen. Jeannie, we also shouldn't go without recognizing that 3 days ago on Friday, when we were all last together, we were wondering if there would be a Speaker of the House in time for these proceedings to take place today, for the election to actually be certified. So far, the worst has not happened, whether in the Speaker's race or any disruptions in the proceedings today. Is this a good sign, or are you just bracing for what comes after this?
So far, so good. But I think we always knew that the Speaker election, it wasn't easy, but it was the easiest part of what Mike Johnson has ahead of him. And now comes the hard work of actually governing. And he obviously has shown over the last 14 months, he's up for the job. He knows how to do this. The problem is not Mike Johnson. The problem are the recalcitrants on the far right side in the House Freedom Caucus who have put up obstructions. I mean, right after he was elected, the letter they sent stipulating that they weren't that crazy about Mike Johnson, but they went with it because of Donald Trump. Well, that's what he's got to hope happens. But they laid out some really big demands that are going to be hard for him to fulfill. So, I will be bracing and watching to see what happens if they can pull this one big mega MAGA or whatever they're calling it, Kaylee, bill in reconciliation.
Well, hold that thought, Jeannie, because that's exactly where we're going to go next. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano will stay with us as we take a look at what's next in Congress for Trump's legislative agenda. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We're 15 days out from the inauguration of President Donald J. Trump for his second term, and we want to make sure that we're jump-starting the agenda now over the next 2 weeks so that he's prepared and ready on day one. President Trump is going to prefer, as he likes to say, one big, beautiful bill. And there's a lot of merit to that because we can put it all together, one big up or down vote, which can save the country, quite literally. Reconciliation is the way to get it done. Why? Because you avoid a 60-vote threshold in the Senate. We're targeting a vote in the House, it may be in the first week of April.
Newly re-elected House Speaker Mike Johnson on Fox News yesterday, sharing his plans for pushing President-elect Trump's legislative agenda through Congress. Back with us now is our signature panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino. So, Rick, it did seem for a second like Donald Trump was behind the Mike Johnson version of things, advocating for one big, powerful bill, as he said on True Social, only then to tell Hugh Hewitt today that he's also open to doing this in two packages. And Punchbowl is reporting now he's going to be meeting with Senate Republican leaders on Wednesday. We know the Senate is advocating for two. So how easily do you think Trump can change his mind on this one?
Oh, I think Trump, he loves to change his mind on things like this. And much to the consternation of House and Senate leadership, who are just trying to get a signal as to which way they're supposed to be going, because that obviously dictates the agenda. Certainly between now and even the inaugural, as Mike Johnson was talking about. But he's kind of like that guy who wants to have his cake and eat it, too. And that's, of course, the Donald Trump we know and love. So, yeah, I think that he's trying to see what the clearest path is to getting as much done as he can, as quick as he can. It's not a great scenario to kick the can too far into the year because it always is harder to get things done the closer you get to midterms. And, of course, those big tax cuts are looming. But at the end of the day, he can get something done quick. And frankly, reconciliation is a good vehicle to try and get the budget done. It's going to be pinching everybody's purse by March 15th. And that could mean he could wind up with an immigration and energy and a few other cats and dogs in a bill that could literally be signed in the next 2 months.
Fascinating, Jeannie. So you put it all in there, jam it all into one bill here, the border, the Trump tax cuts, as he said today, even no taxes on tips, and pull all of this together into one piece of legislation. And then the Senate parliamentarian will weigh in on this and talk about what may or may not qualify for reconciliation bill. John Thune says he does not want anyone in his chamber to overrule the parliamentarian, and that will be the final word on this. Is that where John Thune and Donald Trump start to run into each other?
I think they're going to start to run into each other there. I think at some point, Donald Trump will once again get frustrated with the fact that the filibuster remains in place, as John Thune said on Friday. It's not necessarily frustration with John Thune, but Donald Trump could take it out on him anyways. And, he's
equating these two, Jeannie. He says that reinstating sections that might not get through the parliamentarian would be the equivalent of nuking the filibuster. Are these two going to be able to work together on this? Because it's got to be a budgetary matter, correct, that qualifies for reconciliation.
It has to be a budgetary matter, and it's going to be. I have trouble seeing how Donald Trump is going to get all of this done. One bill, this mega bill, think about the just economic implications alone and what every member of that Freedom Caucus has said on spending, and tell me how he dumps everything in there without going over what they have indeed said. So, I can't imagine how he gets this done. And I can't imagine he's not terribly frustrated with John Thune, because John Thune is something that Donald Trump doesn't like. He's an institutionalist. He wants to retain the rules of the Senate as they've come down. And Donald Trump doesn't care about the rules. He doesn't care about the institution in that way. He wants his bill passed. So I think they are going to clash. And I think he could easily clash with Mike Johnson when Mike Johnson comes up against this House Freedom Caucus and these members of these purple districts who are going to at some point stand up and say, we have had enough.
We've got a lot to look forward to yet this year. Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, Rick Davis, our signature panel, thank you so much for the insights. And be sure to tune into our special coverage Thursday, January 9th. Former President Jimmy Carter's state funeral here in Washington. The special edition of Balance of Power begins at 12 Eastern that day.
And of course, we'll be back with our regular editions of Balance of Power tomorrow. So we'll see you then right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.